Tired of falsity, a millionaire decides to test the world by living as an ordinary person. In a shelter, he finds indifference, but also a young woman who acts differently. Without knowing who he is, she helps him with a rare and silent generosity. And this encounter reveals that true wealth was never in money. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you are watching us. Continuing. Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti woke up that Thursday morning with the feeling that something inside him had definitively broken. From the top of his apartment on Avenida Faria Lima in São Paulo, he watched the city wake up under the thin mist that covered the mirrored buildings. Everything there was imposing, everything there was conquered, everything there was his, and precisely because of that, nothing made sense anymore. At 42 years old, Eduardo commanded an empire built with strategy, vision, and determination. He had inherited a small construction company from his father and transformed it into one of the largest groups in the country's real estate sector. His name appeared on lists of influential personalities, his projects shaped the horizon of the capital of São Paulo, and his decisions moved millions. Meetings with governors, dinners with ambassadors, interviews in business magazines. The routine was intense, the prestige was undeniable, and the comfort was absolute. But Eduardo no longer knew who the people around him were. He put on his imported silk robe and walked to the balcony. Down below, traffic was already beginning to form, small points of light moving like obedient ants. He knew well that feeling of being above, separate, protected by armored glass and lobbies that filtered any unwanted presence. In recent years, however, this protection had become an invisible prison. How many times had he caught himself observing conversations around him and realizing that every word, every gesture, every smile carried ulterior motives? How many times had he felt that the compliments were memorized formulas, that friendships were implicit contracts, and that even affection seemed conditioned on what he could offer? Eduardo was not naive. He knew that power attracts interest. But he had reached a point where he could no longer distinguish where genuine admiration ended and where calculated convenience began. The night before, during a charity dinner at the Club Paulistano, he had carefully observed every interaction. Businessmen who approached with wide smiles, praising his latest development in the South Zone. Socialites who touched his arm with rehearsed familiarity, reminding him of commitments he barely remembered making. Young executives who hung on his every word as if he were revealing secrets of the universe. And everyone, absolutely everyone, measuring their own sentences, adjusting their tone, calculating the ideal proximity. He went back inside the apartment and picked up his cell phone. 17 unread messages. "Good morning, Eduardo. I hope you rested. About that project we talked about. Congratulations on the article in Exam. We need to align our schedule. All cordial, all efficient, all empty." He set the device aside and went to the closet. Italian suits lined up, silk ties, custom-made shoes. Each piece was armor he wore to face a world where his image was worth more than his essence. It was then that the idea, which had been haunting him for weeks, finally took definitive shape. Eduardo needed to know if disinterested kindness still existed in the world. He needed to find out if anyone would be capable of treating him with dignity when he had nothing to offer but his naked humanity. He needed to understand if everything he had lived in recent years was real, or just a collective performance sustained by what he represented. And for that, he needed to disappear. In the following days, Eduardo put into practice a plan that seemed absurd even to himself. He consulted only one person, Mario, his driver and security guard of over 15 years, the only one he fully trusted. Mario knew his doubts, his anxieties, and his silences. When Eduardo explained the idea, the grey-haired man just nodded without judgment. "I'm going to disappear for a few days, Mario. I need to see how people act when they don't know who I am." Mario looked at him with the expression of someone who understands more than words say. "Where does the sir intend to go?" "To a place where no one recognizes me, where I am just another person." Eduardo paused and completed, "To a shelter." It was Mario who researched and found the Casa de Acolhida São Vicente, an institution maintained by donations and voluntary work in the Brás region, the East Zone of São Paulo. The place received people in situations of temporary vulnerability, offering collective dormitories, simple meals and basic support, while they tried to reorganize their lives. It was not a luxury space, but it was organized, safe, and sustained by people who believed in second chances. Eduardo spent 2 days preparing. He let his stubble grow, swapped his suits for simple, worn-out clothes bought at thrift stores on the outskirts, hid his Swiss watch, and put a cheap plastic model on his wrist. He studied how to move with weariness in his shoulders, how to lower his gaze, how to take up less space. He needed to look like someone whom life had bent, not someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. On Sunday afternoon, Mario dropped him off 3 blocks from the Casa de Acogida. Eduardo carried only an old backpack with the bare essentials. He walked through the busy streets of Brass, passing fabric stores, street vendors, and families enjoying the weekend. No one looked twice at him. For the first time in years, Eduardo was invisible. When he reached the entrance of the shelter, a 2-story building with faded paint and bars on the windows, he felt his heart race. The door was open. A small internal courtyard revealed some people sitting on wooden benches, talking quietly or just resting in silence. In the back, a middle-aged woman was organizing donation boxes. Eduardo took a deep breath and entered. A coordinator named Donna Celia, in her early 50s with a tired but attentive look, received him in the small administration room. She asked basic questions, noted information on a simple form, and explained the rules of the place in a firm but not harsh voice. Mealtimes, dormitory division, shared cleaning tasks, mutual respect. Eduardo listened to everything as if he were learning a new language. "Your name?" Eduardo hesitated for only a second. Carlos Silva." Donna Celia looked up from the form and studied him briefly, but said nothing. She wrote down the fake name and continued. "You can stay in the men's dormitory on the 2nd floor. Dinner is at 6. Tomorrow we will talk more about how you can help with the tasks." Eduardo thanked her with a nod and went up the narrow stairs. The dormitory was large, with rows of metal bunks and small lockers next to each bed. Some people were lying down, others were arranging belongings, others were just looking out the window. No one greeted him, no one asked anything. He chose an empty bunk in the corner, put away his backpack, and sat on the bed, feeling for the first time the real weight of that decision. At that moment, Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti, one of the richest and most influential men in São Paulo, was just another stranger trying to find his place in a world that owed him nothing. And it was exactly in this condition that, hours later, during the dinner served in the simple cafeteria of the shelter, he saw her for the first time. Luisa Ferreira was 26 years old, with brown hair tied in a discreet ponytail, and a way of moving that seemed to not want to bother anyone. She wore a faded long-sleeved shirt and worn-out jeans, but everything about her seemed cared for with attention, as if she wanted to preserve dignity even in the simplest clothes. She helped serve the food, passing between the tables with a pot of rice, offering portions with delicacy. Eduardo took his plate and sat at a secluded table, observing. The meal was basic: rice, beans, cooked vegetables, and a small piece of chicken. But it was hot and had been prepared with care. He ate slowly, still adjusting to the reality around him. It was then that he noticed Luisa approaching an elderly gentleman who was sitting alone looking at his empty plate with a confused expression. She knelt beside him, lightly touched his shoulder, and asked in a low voice if he needed help. The man murmured something Eduardo couldn't hear, but he saw Luisa take his plate, serve the food with care, and return to place it in front of him, saying something that made the gentleman offer a shy smile. It wasn't a grand gesture. It didn't attract attention, but Eduardo noticed something in the way she acted, a combination of respect and sweetness that didn't seem feigned. After dinner, the people dispersed. Some went back to the dormitories, others stayed in the courtyard talking. Eduardo went up slowly, still processing everything. He lay on the bunk and stared at the stained ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city entering through the half-open window. Distant horns, voices from the street, the creaking of the wind on the roof tiles. For the first time in a long time, Eduardo had control over nothing. He couldn't make a call and solve a problem. He couldn't delegate a task. He couldn't pay for something to happen the way he wanted. There, he was just one among many, carrying a fake name and a real loneliness. And as he closed his eyes trying to sleep, The image of that young woman with delicate gestures returned to his mind. There was something in her he couldn't name yet, but which was already beginning to provoke a different restlessness. It was only the first day. Eduardo still didn't know that his life was about to change in a way that no business plan, no corporate strategy, and no fortune could predict. Luisa Ferreira, without imagining who that man with the tired look who had just arrived really was already beginning, unintentionally, to return to Eduardo something he thought he had lost forever. The capacity to believe. Eduardo woke up to the sound of low voices and the creaking of bunks around him. The morning light entered weakly through the dormitory window, revealing the movement of men already preparing for the day. Some took towels and went toward the collective bathroom. Others organized their few clothes in the small lockers. No one talked much. Each seemed immersed in their own thoughts, in their own silent battles. He sat on the bed and rubbed his face, feeling the stubble scratch the palm of his hand. He had slept poorly, bothered by the thin mattress and the unknown sounds. But more than the physical discomfort, it was the feeling of being completely out of his element that kept him in a state of alert. There was no bell to call someone. There was no coffee prepared by a housekeeper. There was no security of familiar walls. Everything was strange. Everything was exposed. He went down the stairs holding the small toiletry bag he had brought and found a line formed at the bathroom door. Men waited with tired patience, some leaning against the wall, others looking at the floor. Eduardo took his place at the end of the line and waited. 20 minutes later, he finally entered the cramped space with cracked tiles and a shower that dripped cold water. He showered quickly, put on the simple clothes he had set aside, and returned to the dormitory to put away his belongings. When he went down again, the cafeteria was already busy. Breakfast was served on a long table, bread with margarine, coffee with milk in aluminum pitchers, and some fruit. Eduardo took a plate and served himself, still feeling observed, even though no one seemed to pay attention to him. He sat in a corner and ate slowly, observing. That was when she appeared again. Luisa entered the cafeteria carrying a box of bread that seemed to have just arrived. She was talking to Donna Celia, the coordinator, and the two were organizing the bread in baskets to facilitate access. Eduardo noticed that Luisa didn't just put the bread any which way, but arranged it with care, separating those that were fresher and leaving them visible. A small gesture, but one that revealed attention. After organizing everything, Luisa took her own coffee and sat at a table near a group of women who were talking low. She didn't try to be the center of attention. She didn't speak loudly, but every now and then she smiled at something someone said and made brief comments. There was a naturalness in her that contrasted with the tension Eduardo felt in many other people there. After breakfast, Donna Celia gathered everyone in the internal courtyard to distribute the day's tasks. Some would help clean the dormitories, others in organizing the donation warehouse, others in preparing lunch. Eduardo was assigned to sweep the courtyard and arrange the benches. Simple work, but necessary. While sweeping, he observed the movement around him. The shelter operated with a dynamic of mandatory collaboration. Whoever was there needed to contribute in some way, not just consume. This created a sense of shared responsibility, but also revealed tensions. Some people complained quietly about the tasks, others did the bare minimum, and there were those who genuinely exerted themselves. Luisa was among those who exerted themselves. Eduardo saw her working in the organization of the warehouse, separating donated clothes by size and condition. She wasn't alone. There were 2 other women helping, but it was evident that Luisa coordinated with delicacy. She suggested where to put each pile, folded pieces with care, and occasionally found something in good condition and set it aside with a smile, commenting that it would be useful for someone specific. At a certain point, Eduardo saw her pick up a grey sweatshirt that looked almost new and walk over to a young man who was sitting in the courtyard, staring at nothing. She approached, said something low, and held out the jacket. The young man hesitated, but Luisa insisted with kindness, and he eventually accepted. He put the piece on, and Eduardo saw, for the first time since he arrived there, that young man show something like gratitude in his eyes. It wasn't just the donation of the jacket, it was the way Luisa did it, without superiority, without turning the gesture into a spectacle, without making the other feel diminished. She simply saw a need and found a way to supply it with respect. Eduardo continued sweeping, but his attention was divided. Lunch was served at noon: rice, beans, lettuce salad, and a simple meat stew with potatoes. Eduardo served himself and returned to sit in a corner, still maintaining the posture of someone who wanted to go unnoticed. But while he ate, he noticed a movement that caught his attention. Luisa was serving an elderly lady who had difficulty holding the spoon. Instead of simply putting the food on the plate and moving on, Luisa pulled up a chair, sat next to the woman, and began talking to her while helping in a discreet way. She wasn't feeding the lady as if she were incapable, but creating a companionship that made the moment less lonely. Eduardo felt something strange move inside him. It wasn't pity for what he saw, nor superficial admiration. It was something deeper, a restlessness he couldn't name. He was used to seeing performative kindness, the kind that comes accompanied by cameras, speeches, and public recognition. But that was different. That was kindness by intimate choice, without an audience, without a reward. In the afternoon, Eduardo had his first direct conflict in the shelter. While organizing the benches in the courtyard, a man in his early 30s approached with an irritated expression. He was tall, had tattoos on his arms, and a way of walking that tried to impose presence. He pointed to one of the benches and said in a harsh voice that that was his spot and that Eduardo should find another corner. Eduardo stopped holding the broom. For a moment his instinct was to respond in kind, impose authority, set limits. But he remembered where he was and who he was pretending to be. Carlos Silva had no authority. Carlos Silva was just another person trying to survive. So he just nodded and moved away. The man let out a grunt of approval and sat on the bench as if he had conquered territory. Eduardo continued sweeping, but felt for the first time the bitter taste of being treated as invisible. It wasn't the rudeness itself that bothered him, but the ease with which the other simply discarded his presence, as if he didn't have enough value even for an educated conversation. It was Luisa who witnessed the scene from afar. She didn't say anything at that moment, but Eduardo noticed that she had observed everything. And later, when the tattooed man was distracted talking to others, Luisa approached Eduardo discreetly. "He always does that," she said in a low voice. "He tries to mark territory, don't take it personally. It's his way of feeling safe." Eduardo looked at her, surprised that someone had taken the trouble to offer comfort. "No problem," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Luisa gave a half-smile. "Everyone here is trying to protect something. Sometimes we forget that kindness costs nothing." She moved away before Eduardo could respond, but the words kept echoing. In the following days, Eduardo immersed himself completely in the shelter's routine. He woke up with the others, had a simple breakfast, fulfilled his tasks, had lunch, spent the afternoons observing, had dinner, and returned to the dormitory. Slowly, he began to understand the dynamics of that place. There were those who were there temporarily, in transition to some solution. There were those who carried longer and more complicated stories. There were those who helped each other, and those who isolated themselves. And there was Luisa, who seemed to move among everyone with the same delicacy. Eduardo saw her help a young mother calm a baby who cried non-stop, simply taking the child in her arms and humming softly while the mother rested for a few minutes. He saw Luisa mediate a discussion between two women about the use of the bathroom, listening to both sides and suggesting an agreement that neither of them had thought of. He saw Luisa set aside part of her own meal and discreetly place it on the plate of a gentleman who had arrived late and missed dinner. Each gesture seemed small in isolation, but Eduardo began to realize that, added up, they formed a pattern. Luisa didn't help out of occasional impulse. She helped out of constant choice. And the most impressive thing, she did it even when no one was looking. One night after dinner, Eduardo went out to the courtyard to get some fresh air. He sat on one of the distant benches and watched the city lights in the distance. São Paulo pulsed beyond those walls, with its skyscrapers, its expensive restaurants, its fast-paced lives. He knew that world well. But there, in that simple shelter, he was discovering another universe. That was when he heard light footsteps. Luisa appeared carrying a box with folded blankets. She hadn't seen him. She walked to a corner of the courtyard where there was an external locker and began to organize the blankets, checking if they were clean and separating those that needed repair. She did everything with care, folding each piece again when it didn't look the way she thought was appropriate. Eduardo observed her in silence. No one had asked for that. No one was supervising. Luisa simply did it because she believed that if someone needed a blanket during the night, that someone deserved to find something well cared for. She finally noticed his presence and started slightly. "Sorry, I didn't see anyone was here," she said with a shy smile. "No problem," Eduardo replied. "I was just getting some air." Luisa nodded and went back to work. After a few seconds of silence, she asked without looking directly at him, "Are you managing to adapt?" Eduardo hesitated. The question was simple, but it carried genuine care. "I'm trying." "It's hard at first," Luisa said, folding another blanket. "We feel out of place, but it passes. How long have you been here?" Eduardo asked, taking advantage of the opening. 5 months, she replied naturally. "I arrived with nothing. Donatelia welcomed me, and since then I've been trying to gather the means to rent a little place of my own." Eduardo felt a pang of something he didn't expect. Guilt, perhaps. There was a young woman who fought for something as basic as a place of her own, while he owned apartments he didn't even visit. "And you help everyone here," he said, more as a statement than a question. Luisa shrugged. "I do what I can. When we have almost nothing, sharing the little makes a difference." She finished organizing the blankets, closed the locker, and turned to him. "If you need anything, you can ask. Here, we manage together." Before Eduardo could respond, she'd already moved away, returning inside the shelter with that discreet lightness that seemed to be her trademark. Eduardo was left alone in the courtyard, looking at the dark sky of São Paulo. For the first time in many years, he felt something he didn't expect to feel there. Shame. Shame for having doubted humanity so much that he needed to disguise himself to test it. Shame for having believed that true kindness was impossible. Shame for having lived surrounded by so much and learned so little about what really mattered. Luisa Ferreira, without knowing it, was beginning to dismantle every certainty that Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti had built about the world. And he still had no idea how much that would transform him. Eduardo's second week at the shelter brought a subtle but noticeable change. He no longer felt like a complete stranger in that environment. He knew the faces, understood the routine, and was beginning to recognize the small rituals that made coexistence possible. But more than adapting to the place, Eduardo realized that something inside him was changing irreversibly. His mornings now included brief conversations with other residents, nothing deep, just greetings and comments about the weather or the day's tasks. But these were interactions he used to avoid, preferring to keep a safe distance. Gradually, however, he discovered that those people had stories, had names, had dignity that went far beyond the circumstances that brought them there. There was Sir Augusto, a gentleman of almost 70 who had worked his whole life as a carpenter and lost everything after a health problem that prevented him from continuing. There was Jessica, a young single mother of 23 who had fled a difficult relationship and was trying to rebuild her life with her small son. There was Tiago, the young man Luisa had given the jacket to, who had come from the interior of São Paulo in search of opportunities and was still trying to find stable work. Each story was a universe of choices, losses, and resilience. And Eduardo, who had spent years judging the world from atop his glass tower, was beginning to understand that the line between having everything and having nothing was much more fragile than he had imagined. But it was Luisa who continued to occupy the center of his observations. One morning during breakfast, Eduardo witnessed a scene that marked him deeply. Donna Celia announced that the donations for that week had been lower than expected and that it would be necessary to ration some items to ensure they lasted until the next shipment. The news generated an immediate atmosphere of tension. Some people complained, others showed concern, and there were those who began to question if everyone there really needed to be receiving help. That was when a middle-aged man named Gilberto raised his voice, accusing some people of taking more than they deserved. He looked directly at Jessica, the young mother, and said with disdain that she should have thought better before having a child if she didn't have the means to support him. The silence that settled was cutting. Jessica lowered her head, holding her son in her lap, and Eduardo saw tears begin to roll down her face. No one said anything. Some looked away, Others continued eating as if nothing had happened. The casual cruelty of that sentence hung in the air like a heavy cloud. But then Luisa stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. She simply walked over to Gilberto, stood before him, and said with serene firmness, "We are here because life brought us here, not because we chose to be. Judging doesn't change anything. It only makes everything harder." Gilberto tried to push back. "And who do you think you are to give me a moral lesson?" Luisa held his gaze. "Nobody. Just someone who knows that tomorrow it could be me needing help. And I hope that if it is, someone has the kindness not to judge me." She turned, walked to Jessica and sat beside her, placing her hand on the young woman's shoulder in a silent gesture of support. She didn't say anything, just stayed there. And that presence was enough for Jessica to take a deep breath and wipe away her tears. Eduardo felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just the gesture itself, but the quiet courage behind it. Luisa didn't seek applause. She didn't want to be a heroine. She simply couldn't stay silent in the face of cruelty. Later, when everyone had dispersed, Eduardo sought her out in the courtyard. She was sitting alone, looking at her hands as if still processing what had happened. "You didn't have to do that," Eduardo said, sitting beside her. Luisa looked at him with surprise. "Yes, I did. Jessica is already suffering enough. She didn't deserve to be humiliated." Eduardo nodded slowly. "You have courage." She gave a tired smile. "It's not courage, it's just not being able to pretend I didn't see it." They stayed in silence for a few minutes. Then Luisa asked with genuine curiosity, "And you, Carlos? Where did you come from? You never talk about yourself." Eduardo hesitated. He had prepared a simple, generic story, but facing those attentive eyes, he felt that any elaborate lie would be an offense. "From far away," he replied vaguely. "Very far." Luisa didn't insist. "Sometimes it's better to leave the past where it is," she said. "What matters is what we do now." That phrase echoed in Eduardo's mind for the following days. What matters is what we do now. He had spent so much time planning, strategizing, building a future based on achievements and accumulation. But when was the last time he stopped to think about the immediate impact of his actions? When was the last time he did something good without calculating the return? The shelter's routine continued, but Eduardo began to pay more attention to the details. He noticed that Luisa always had breakfast last, after everyone else had served themselves. He noticed that when there was dessert or something special, she discreetly left her portion for whoever seemed to need it more. He noticed that she spent time talking to Sir Augusto, listening to old carpentry stories, just so the gentleman wouldn't feel forgotten. And there was something else Eduardo observed with growing restlessness. Luisa was loved by many, but there were also those who looked at her with a certain discomfort. People who were bothered by her kindness because it exposed, by contrast, their own coldness. Gilberto, for example, began to make acidic comments whenever Luisa helped someone, insinuating that she did it to show off. But Luisa never fought back. She just continued being who she was. One afternoon, Eduardo found her in the donation warehouse separating children's clothes for Jessica's son. She chose each piece with care, checking if they were in good condition, washing those that needed it before delivering them. Eduardo offered to help, and for the first time they worked side by side in comfortable silence. That was when Luisa broke the silence with an unexpected question. "Do you think people are born good or learn to be?" Eduardo stopped folding a shirt and looked at her. "Why the question?" Luisa shrugged. "Sometimes I look around and see so many people hardened by life, and I wonder if they were always like that, or if the world made them that way." Eduardo thought carefully before answering. "I think we choose every day what kind of person we want to be, even when it's hard." Luisa smiled. "It's beautiful to think that way." "You don't think so?" Eduardo asked. She paused. "I want to believe so. That it's always possible to choose kindness even when everything pushes us to the contrary." Eduardo felt the weight of those words. Luisa wasn't talking about naive optimism. She was talking about a conscious decision, renewed each day, not to allow difficulties to transform her into someone bitter. That night, Eduardo had trouble sleeping. Lying on the bunk, listening to the snores and sighs around him, he thought about his life before all of this. He thought about the meetings where decisions that affected hundreds of families were made coldly, based only on spreadsheets and projections. He thought about the times he dismissed employees without even looking them in the eye. He thought about how many opportunities he had to make a real difference in someone's life, and chose indifference out of convenience. Louisa was showing him without words that there was another way to exist. The following days brought an even greater test for Louisa's kindness. A new resident arrived at the shelter. Her name was Vera, a woman in her early 30s with a hard and suspicious expression. From the first day, she made it clear she wasn't there to make friends. She took what she needed, fulfilled the minimum tasks, and kept her distance from everyone. But Vera had a problem. She had arrived with a leg infection that needed constant care. Donna Celia instructed her to change the bandages daily, but Vera showed difficulty doing it alone. Some people tried to help, but she rejected them harshly, saying she didn't need anyone's pity. It was Louisa who found the right approach. Instead of offering help directly, she began to leave clean bandaging material next to Vera's bed without saying anything. Then she started making casual comments about how she herself had had a similar wound and what had worked for her. Gradually, without pressure, without invasion, she created an opening. One night, Eduardo saw Louisa sitting beside Vera, changing the bandage on her leg with delicacy. Vera didn't say thank you, didn't show emotion, but she allowed the care. And for Louisa, that seemed to be enough. Later, Eduardo found her washing her hands in the collective bathroom. "Why do you do that?" he asked. Louisa looked at him through the mirror's reflection. "Do what?" "Effort yourself so much with people who don't even thank you." She turned off the faucet and dried her hands. "Because everyone deserves care, regardless of how they react to it." Eduardo felt something break inside him. It was no longer just observation. It was transformation. He, who had tested people as if they were investment projects, was before someone who treated every human being as if they were valuable simply for the fact of existing. That night, before sleeping, Eduardo made a decision. He could no longer continue pretending. He could no longer treat that as a controlled experiment. Louisa deserved to know the truth, and he needed to recognize that his test had completely failed. Not because he didn't find kindness, but because he found much more than he expected, and that changed everything. Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti, the man who thought he had seen everything, was being remade inside by a young woman who had so little and gave so much. And the scariest part, he didn't want to leave anymore. He didn't want to go back to the life he knew because for the first time in years, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be. Beside someone who taught him, without knowing it, the true meaning of wealth. Eduardo's third week at the shelter began with a grey and rainy morning typical of São Paulo. Water hit the roof hard, creating a constant sound that filled the silence of the dormitory. Eduardo woke up early, as he was becoming accustomed to doing, and went down to the cafeteria where breakfast was already being prepared. Louisa was there as always, helping to organize the cups and bread. But Eduardo noticed something different about her. There was a paleness in her face, a slowness in her movements that was not habitual. When she picked up the coffee pitcher to place it on the table, her hands trembled slightly, and Eduardo saw her close her eyes for a moment, as if she were trying to maintain her balance. "Are you okay?" he asked, approaching. Louisa opened her eyes and forced a smile. "I am. Just a little tired." But Eduardo realized it was more than tiredness. Throughout breakfast, he observed that she barely touched her own food. Other people also noticed and made comments, but Louisa insisted she was fine, that it would soon pass. Donna Celia, however, was not convinced. After breakfast, she called Louisa to talk privately. Eduardo didn't hear the conversation, but saw through the window the two talking seriously, with Donna Celia gesturing with concern and Louisa shaking her head, apparently trying to minimize something. Hours later, Eduardo found out what was happening. Jessica, the young mother, looked for Donna Celia in a state of agitation. Her son had a high fever, and she didn't have the money to buy the medicine the clinic doctor had prescribed. Donna Celia checked the shelter's cash box, but resources were tight until the next donation. She promised to try to get help, but couldn't guarantee anything before the next day. Jessica left in despair, holding her son who was crying softly. Eduardo was in the courtyard when he saw Louisa quickly leave the shelter, putting a thin jacket over her shoulders, despite the rain that was still falling. She didn't even take an umbrella. Without thinking much, Eduardo followed her. He walked behind her through the wet streets of Brass, keeping enough distance not to be noticed. Luisa walked fast, with determination, even clearly weakened. She entered a pharmacy a few blocks away. Eduardo waited outside, observing through the window. He saw Luisa talk to the attendant, pick up a box of medicine and take it to the register. He saw her open a small cloth bag she carried and take out crumpled bills, counting each one with care. They were few bills, clearly the little money she had managed to save. When Luisa left the pharmacy holding the bag with the medicine, Eduardo finally understood. She was sick, needing her own care, but she had used the money she had to buy medicine for someone else's child. Eduardo felt something deep move inside him. It wasn't superficial admiration. It was astonishment at a choice that defied all the logic of self-preservation he knew. Luisa had no guarantee of when she would manage to save money again. She had no security at all. And yet she chose to care for another's need before her own. He followed her back to the shelter, keeping his distance. He saw Luisa hand the medicine to Jessica, who received it with tears of gratitude. He saw Luisa say something that made Jessica smile through the tears, probably minimizing the gesture. He saw Luisa move away before they could ask more questions, returning to the dormitory with even slower steps. Eduardo stood in the courtyard, trying to process what he had witnessed. He who commanded millions, who made decisions about giant developments, who negotiated complex contracts, was completely disarmed by that radical simplicity. Luisa didn't do that to impress. She didn't do it to be recognized. She did it because she saw a child suffering and had in her hands the capacity to alleviate that suffering, even if it cost her. That night, Eduardo couldn't eat dinner. He went up to the dormitory and lay on the bed staring at the stained ceiling. For the first time since he arrived there, he cried. It wasn't a dramatic cry, but silent tears that came down without him being able to control them. He cried for the arrogance of thinking he could test humanity. He cried for having lived so long surrounded by empty praise without realizing he was dying inside. He cried because he found in a young woman without possessions a moral wealth he would never achieve with all his money. And he cried because he realized he was no longer an observer. He was a participant. He was emotionally involved in a way he hadn't planned and didn't know how to handle. In the following days, Eduardo decided to act. He started small because he didn't want to attract attention. When donations arrived, he discreetly separated the best pieces and found ways to ensure Luisa received them. When there were heavier tasks, he offered to do them before she needed to. When he noticed she was tired, he created situations so she could rest without it seeming like she was being spared. Luisa noticed. One afternoon, while they were organizing the warehouse together, she asked with a curious smile, "You've been helping me a lot." "Why?" Eduardo didn't expect the direct question. He hesitated. "Because you deserve it." Luisa laughed softly. "Everyone here deserves it, but you choose to help me specifically." Eduardo stopped stacking the boxes and faced her. "Because you are special, Luisa. You don't realize it, but you are." She became serious, as if those words had touched her in an unexpected way. "I'm not special, I just do what anyone should do." "But not everyone does," Eduardo said with an intensity that surprised himself. They remained in silence for a few seconds. Then Luisa asked, with a vulnerability Eduardo hadn't seen in her yet, "Do you really think kindness makes a difference? Sometimes I feel the world is too big, the problems are too many, and everything I do is just a drop in the ocean." Eduardo approached. "But what if it's precisely that drop that prevents someone from giving up? And what if it's that drop that shows a person that it's still worth believing?" Luisa looked at him with shining eyes. "You speak like someone who already gave up and found a reason to come back." Eduardo felt his chest tighten. He was dangerously close to revealing everything. "Maybe," he replied vaguely. Luisa lightly touched his arm, a simple gesture but loaded with empathy. "Then I'm glad you're here, Carlos. I'm glad you came back." That touch, that sentence almost made Eduardo confess everything right there. But he contained the impulse. It wasn't the moment yet. There was still something he needed to understand. The answer came a few days later, in a way he would never have expected. One night after dinner, Eduardo went out to the courtyard and found Luisa sitting alone on one of the benches, looking at the dark sky. She seemed lost in deep thoughts. He approached slowly. "Can I sit?" Louisa nodded, making room. They stayed in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then Louisa began to speak, almost as if she were thinking out loud. "You know, Carlos, before I got here I went through very difficult times. I lost important people, I lost paths I thought were right, I lost trust in many people, and at some point I realized I had two choices. Either I let all that make me a bitter person, or I use the pain to better understand the pain of others." Eduardo listened in silence, feeling the weight of each word. Louisa continued, "I chose the second option, not because I'm strong or special, but because I discovered that helping others helped me keep going. Every time I saw someone smile, every time I managed to alleviate a bit of someone's suffering, I felt that my own pain had some meaning, as if everything I went through prepared me to be present when someone else needed it." Eduardo felt tears threaten to rise again. "And what if one day you discover that someone deceived you, that someone was not who they said they were?" Louisa looked at him attentively. "Why the question?" Eduardo looked away. "Just curiosity." Louisa thought for a moment. "I think it would depend on the reason for the lie. If it were to harm me, it would hurt. But if it were because the person was afraid or confused or trying to protect themselves, I would try to understand. In the end, everyone is fighting battles we don't see." That answer was like a light cutting through the darkness. Eduardo realized that Louisa was not naive. She knew human complexity, she knew imperfection, she knew pain, and yet she chose compassion. "Louisa, can I ask you something?" Eduardo said, taking courage. "Sure. If someone very rich appeared here, offering to take you out of this situation, to give you a comfortable life, would you accept?" Louisa laughed as if the question were absurd. "It depends. What would that person expect in return?" "Nothing, just recognition of who you are." Louisa became serious. "It would be strange. I'm not used to receiving without giving something in return. But if it were genuine, if it didn't come with hidden expectations, I think so. Not because I want luxury, but because I could do more for others if I had more resources." Eduardo smiled with sadness. "You wouldn't keep anything for yourself?" Louisa shrugged. "Enough to live with dignity. The rest I'd prefer to use to help. Money in the hand of someone who doesn't need it is just paper. In the hand of someone who can transform lives, it's a tool." At that moment, Eduardo made the final decision. He could no longer stay hidden. He could no longer pretend to be Carlos Silva. Louisa deserved the truth, and he needed to offer her not an exit through charity, but a real recognition of the value she represented. But before revealing everything, he needed one last gesture. He needed to prove to himself that it was real, that it wasn't just a passing emotional moment. And the opportunity came in an unexpected way. Donna Celia announced that the shelter was facing serious financial difficulties. Donations had fallen, and there was a real risk of having to close the doors or drastically reduce the number of people welcomed. The news fell like a bomb. Louisa was visibly shaken. Eduardo saw her go out alone to the courtyard, hugging her own arms, looking at the ground with an expression of defeat. It was the first time he saw her without hope. He approached slowly. "Everything will be fine," he said. Louisa looked at him with teary eyes. "How can you be sure?" Eduardo took a deep breath. "Because some things are worth fighting to preserve, and this place and you are worth a lot." Louisa let a tear fall. "Sometimes I get tired, you know, tired of fighting." Eduardo placed his hand on her shoulder. "Then rest, and when you are ready, I will be here." Louisa leaned her head on his shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture of trust and vulnerability that pierced Eduardo like an arrow. It was at that moment he knew. It was time to reveal everything. Eduardo spent the night awake, lying on the bunk, staring at the darkness of the ceiling. His mind worked at a fast pace, planning every detail of what he was about to do. It wouldn't just be a revelation. It would be a complete change of everything, for him and for Louisa. He needed to do it right. He needed to ensure that when the truth came out, she would understand it wasn't manipulation, but transformation. At dawn, he asked Donna Celia's permission to leave, saying he needed to resolve urgent personal matters. She agreed without asking questions, accustomed as she was to the comings and goings of the residents. Eduardo left the shelter and walked to a distant point where Mario was waiting for him discreetly. "I need you to do some things for me," Eduardo said, getting into the car for the first time in weeks. The feeling of the soft leather seat was strange after so much time sleeping on bunks. Mario listened attentively as Eduardo explained the plan. He needed to resolve the shelter's financial situation without it seeming like ordinary charity. He needed to prepare a concrete proposal for Luisa, not just empty promises. And he needed to ensure that when he revealed who he was, he had the means to prove his intentions were genuine. Mario, as always, did not question. He just nodded and promised everything would be ready. Eduardo returned to the shelter before lunch. When he entered, he noticed a heavy atmosphere in the air. People were talking in groups with worried expressions. Donna Celia was in the office, on the phone, visibly tense. He looked for Luisa and found her in the cafeteria, helping to prepare lunch with mechanical movements. She seemed distant, lost in somber thoughts. "What happened?" Eduardo asked. Luisa sighed. "Donna Celia got confirmation. If we don't get resources in the next 2 weeks, they'll have to close the shelter, at least temporarily." Eduardo felt the weight of that information. How many people depend on this place? 23 at this moment, Luisa replied. 23 people who have nowhere else to go. She stopped cutting the vegetables and rested her hands on the table, lowering her head. "I hate feeling powerless." Eduardo wanted to say he had already solved everything, that the money was on the way, that no one needed to worry. But he couldn't. Not yet. So he just touched her arm. "Don't give up yet." Luisa looked at him with a tired smile. "You have a faith I wish I had." "I learned it from someone," Eduardo said. Lunch was silent and heavy. Afterward, when everyone had dispersed, Eduardo saw Luisa walk off alone to the courtyard. He followed her and sat beside her on the bench where so many conversations had already taken place. They sat in silence for a while. Then Luisa began to speak, her voice low and vulnerable. "You know what scares me most, Carlos? It's not losing the roof, it's not having to start over again. It's thinking about all these people being thrown back onto the streets, being treated as invisible. It's thinking about Jessica with her little son without a place to stay. It's thinking about Seu Augusto having to sleep under awnings again." Eduardo heard every word as if it were a knife. Luisa continued, "Sometimes I think I try to help everyone because I know what it's like to have no one. I know what it's like to scream for help in silence and have no one listen. I know what it's like to be treated as if you don't exist. And I swore to myself that if I ever had the means, I would never let anyone feel like that near me." She wiped away a tear that escaped. "But maybe I'm not strong enough. Maybe everything I did isn't enough." Eduardo turned to her and without thinking took her hand. "Luisa, look at me." She raised her teary eyes. "You are the strongest person I've ever met. Not because you solve everything, but because you keep trying even when it seems impossible. That is true strength." Luisa squeezed his hand. "How can you believe in me so much?" Eduardo took a deep breath. He was on the verge of telling everything, but something stopped him. There was one last thing he needed to witness. "Because I saw who you really are," he said simply. They sat hand in hand in the silence of the courtyard, two strangers who were no longer strangers, two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely place. In the following days, Eduardo watched Luisa face the possibility of the shelter's closure with a moving determination. Instead of surrendering to despair, she organized meetings with the residents to discuss alternatives. She created contact lists for other shelters, researched social assistance programs, and mobilized everyone to try to find solutions. But what marked Eduardo most happened on an ordinary night. He woke up in the middle of the night thirsty and went down silently to the kitchen. The house was dark and quiet, but as he passed through the cafeteria, he saw a faint light coming from a corner. He approached and stopped, hidden in the shadows. Luisa was there alone, sitting at one of the tables. In front of her was an old notebook and a pen. She wrote carefully, stopping every now and then to think. Eduardo stood watching, intrigued. After a few minutes, Luisa closed the notebook, joined her hands and lowered her head. Eduardo realized she was praying. He didn't hear the words, but he saw the intensity of that moment. He saw Luisa asking, not for herself, but for others. He saw silent tears roll down her face. When she finished, Luisa wiped her face, picked up the notebook and stood up. She went to a small cupboard, put the notebook in a hidden box, and turned off the light. She passed by Eduardo without seeing him, returning to the women's dormitory. Eduardo stood in the darkness, processing what he had witnessed. He approached the cupboard and, hesitant, opened the box. Inside was the notebook. He knew he shouldn't, but something compelled him to open it. The pages were full of names, the names of everyone who lived in the shelter, and next to each name, small notes, specific needs, dreams they had mentioned, important dates, things that made them smile. Luisa had a detailed record of each person, not for control, but to remember how to better care for each one. And on the last page, there was a list of priorities for if the shelter closed. Who needed help most urgently? Who had the best chances of finding alternatives? Who was most vulnerable? Luisa was planning how to save everyone but herself. Her name didn't appear anywhere. Eduardo closed the notebook with trembling hands and put it back. He returned to the dormitory with a heavy heart and absolute certainty. It was no longer about testing human kindness. It was about honoring the kindness he found. The next day, Eduardo asked permission to leave again. He met Mario in a discreet office and reviewed all the documents that had been prepared, the anonymous donation to the shelter that would guarantee its operation for the next 5 years, the expansion project that included improvements in structure and the creation of professional training programs, and the proposal for Luisa. Eduardo didn't just want to take Luisa out of there. He wanted to offer her the chance to amplify what she already did, with resources and structure. He wanted to create an institute focused on welcoming and social reintegration, and he wanted Luisa to coordinate it, because he knew no one would do it better. "Everything is ready," Mario confirmed. "Whenever the sir wants." Eduardo nodded. "Tomorrow, I'm going to reveal everything tomorrow." That night, Eduardo could barely eat at dinner. Luisa noticed and approached. "You're strange today. Did something happen?" Eduardo looked at her, at those eyes that had seen so much suffering and still shone with hope. "Tomorrow something important will happen. I need you to trust me." Luisa frowned, confused. "I do, but you're scaring me." "You don't need to be afraid," Eduardo said. "I promise." After dinner, Eduardo went up to the dormitory and lay down. This time he couldn't sleep from anxiety. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Carlos Silva would disappear, and Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti would return. But he wouldn't be the same man who entered that shelter weeks ago. He would be someone transformed by the kindness of a young woman who had nothing and gave everything. Through the dormitory window, Eduardo watched the illuminated city of São Paulo in the distance. Somewhere out there was his luxury apartment, his business empire, his former life. But none of that seemed more important than what he had found there. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in years, gave thanks. He gave thanks for having had the courage to doubt himself. He gave thanks for having found Luisa. He gave thanks for having learned that true wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in how many lives you can touch with real meaning. And he gave thanks for being about to do something that finally made sense. Before sleeping, Eduardo mentally revisited every moment since he arrived at the shelter. He remembered the first day when he entered with arrogance disguised as humility, thinking he was above it all. He remembered the coldness with which he had planned to observe people as if they were experiments. He remembered how sure he was that he would confirm his cynicism, and then he remembered Luisa. He remembered her first smile, shy but genuine. He remembered each small gesture that added up formed a mountain of kindness. He remembered her courage in defending Jessica. He remembered her hands trembling when she bought medicine for a child that wasn't hers. He remembered the hidden notebook with names and dreams of each person. He remembered when he stopped being an observer and became part of that world. Eduardo realized that in the last few weeks, he had lived more genuinely than in whole years of his previous life. There, stripped of titles and power, he had discovered who he really was when no one applauded him. He discovered that under the armor of the successful businessman, there was a man who just wanted to be seen for who he was, not for what he possessed. And Luisa had seen him. Without knowing his true name, without knowing his wealth, without understanding his influence, she had treated him with dignity. She had talked to him as an equal. She had cared for him when he was out of place. She had trusted him without apparent reason. That trust was what scared him most now, because tomorrow, when he revealed everything, he would run the risk of losing exactly what he valued most: Luisa's trust. What if she felt deceived? What if she interpreted everything as manipulation? What if she looked at him with contempt and said he had no right to play with people's lives that way? Eduardo knew he would face those possibilities. He knew he could lose the only true thing he had found in years, but he also knew he could no longer keep lying. Luisa deserved honesty, even if that honesty cost the relationship between them. He turned on his side in the bunk and hugged the thin pillow. Tomorrow would be the most important day of his life, not because he would reveal wealth, but because he would reveal transformation. And he hoped Luisa would be able to see beyond the initial shock and realize that the man lying in a shelter in Brass, crying in silence for fear of losing something precious, was more real than any businessman who commanded boardrooms. Tomorrow would be the day of revelation, and Eduardo was ready to face the consequences of his decision, whatever they might be, because Luisa deserved the truth, and he deserved the chance to show that his transformation was real. The morning arrived clear and sunny, as if the sky itself knew that this would be a different day. Eduardo woke up early, showered carefully, and put on the simple clothes for the last time. He looked at himself in the broken mirror of the collective bathroom and saw in his own eyes something he hadn't seen in years. Peace. Nervousness, yes, but also peace. He went down for breakfast and found Luisa already helping to organize the table. She saw him and smiled, that smile that now meant everything to him. "Good morning, Carlos." "Good morning, Luisa." After breakfast, Donna Celia asked everyone to gather in the cafeteria. There was an important announcement to make. People crowded in, some sitting, others standing, all with worried expressions. They thought it was the confirmation of the closure. Eduardo stood at the back of the room observing. His heart was racing. Donna Celia began to speak. "People, I know everyone is worried about the shelter's situation, and I came here today to give you some news." The silence was absolute. "We received a donation, a very generous donation. The shelter is not going to close. On the contrary, we are going to be able to expand, improve the structure, create new programs." A murmur of surprise and relief swept through the room. Some people began to cry with emotion. Jessica hugged her son tightly. Seu Augusto wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "But that's not all," Donna Celia continued. "The donor asked to be here today. He wants to speak personally with everyone." That was when the cafeteria door opened. Mario entered first, followed by two assistants carrying folders and documents, and then Eduardo entered. But he was no longer the disheveled and tired Eduardo everyone knew as Carlos. He was Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti, wearing an impeccable suit, haircut, and beard shaved. The physical transformation was shocking. The silence that settled was different. It was absolute astonishment. Luisa was standing near the table holding a coffee pitcher. When she saw Eduardo enter, the pitcher slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. No one moved to clean it up. Eduardo walked to the center of the room. His heart was racing, but he kept his voice firm. "My name is not Carlos Silva. My name is Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti. Many of you may have heard of me. I'm a businessman, president of one of the largest real estate groups in the country." People looked at each other, incredulous. Gilberto, the man who had humiliated Jessica, was pale. Eduardo continued, "I came here a few weeks ago with a purpose. I was tired of living surrounded by people who approached me only for what I could offer. I wanted to find out if genuine kindness still existed in the world, so I assumed a false identity and came to this shelter as just another person." Luisa was motionless, tears beginning to roll down her face. Eduardo looked directly at her. "And what I found here changed my life completely. I saw people fighting with dignity. I saw cooperation where I expected only dispute. I saw resilience where I expected only surrender. But above all, I found someone who taught me the true meaning of wealth." He walked toward Luisa. She took a step back, confused, hurt, scared. "Luisa Ferreira," Eduardo said, his voice loaded with emotion. "You welcomed me when I was a stranger. You treated me with dignity when I had nothing to offer. You showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it. And you did all that without expecting anything in return." Luisa shook her head, tears falling freely now. "You lied. You pretended to be someone else. I lied about my name and my financial situation," Eduardo admitted. "But everything I felt here was true. Every conversation we had, every moment we shared, every transformation that happened inside me was real. You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever, Louisa. The capacity to believe in human kindness. But why? Louisa asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Because I was afraid, Eduardo replied with raw honesty. Afraid that if you knew who I was, you would change the way you treated me. Afraid that the kindness I saw would be replaced by interest. And when I realized my fear was selfish, when I understood that you deserved the truth, I decided to reveal everything. But not before ensuring that this revelation came accompanied by something concrete. He signaled to Mario, who stepped forward with the documents. The donation that saved the shelter was mine. But I don't want it to be just that. I want to create an institute focused on welcoming and social reintegration. A place where people in situations of vulnerability can rebuild their lives with dignity, professional training and emotional support. And I want you to coordinate this project, Louisa, because no one does it better than you. Louisa looked at the documents Mario was holding, then back at Eduardo. Do you think you can buy my trust? No, Eduardo said immediately. I don't want to buy anything. I want to recognize. I want the world to see what I saw. You have a rare talent, Louisa. You know how to care for people. You know how to see dignity where others see only need. And that cannot be limited to one shelter. It can transform hundreds, thousands of lives. Louisa closed her eyes, trying to process everything. The other people in the cafeteria watched in absolute silence, some with tears, others with shame, others simply shocked. Eduardo took another step toward her. I understand if you don't want to accept. I understand if you never want to speak to me again. But I need you to know one thing. I entered here as a rich man trying to prove the world was cold. I am leaving as someone who discovered that the greatest wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we are capable of giving without expecting anything in return. And I learned that from you. Louisa opened her eyes, looking directly at him. You hurt me, Eduardo. You made me believe in a friendship that was based on a lie. I know, he said, his voice breaking, and I will carry that. But the friendship was real, Louisa. Every conversation we had, every moment you showed me kindness, every time you made me believe there was still hope, all of that was real. It was I who was hidden behind a false name, but the man who talked to you in the courtyard, who admired you in silence, who cried seeing your generosity, that was the real me. The silence stretched. Louisa looked around, saw the people waiting, saw Jessica holding her son, saw Seu Augusto with an emotional expression, saw even Gilberto with his head down. Then she looked back at Eduardo. How you said you learned from me, but what if I say I also learned from you? Eduardo blinked, surprised. Louisa wiped away her tears. You arrived here afraid to trust people. I was also afraid. I spent so much time being ignored, being treated as invisible, that I built walls to protect myself. But when I saw you, when I realized you were as lost as I was, I remembered why I chose kindness, because someone at some point was also kind to me when I needed it most. And that saved me. She took a deep breath. You lied about your name, but you didn't lie about your transformation. I saw it happen. I saw you change every day. I saw you become more human, more present, more real. And if what you are offering is a chance to do what I do here on a larger scale, then it's not about you saving me. It's about us building together something that matters. Eduardo felt tears rise. You accept? Louisa gave a half-smile. I accept, but on one condition. What is it? That you never lie to me again. That you are always this Eduardo who is here now, vulnerable and true, not the powerful businessman who impresses everyone, the man who cried in a shelter because he discovered he no longer knew who he was. Eduardo nodded, unable to speak. Louisa extended her hand. So let's start over. My name is Louisa Ferreira, and you are? Eduardo took her hand. Eduardo Almeida Cavalcanti, and I am learning to be a better person. The cafeteria exploded in applause. Jessica was crying, Seu Augusto was smiling, even Gilberto seemed moved. Donna Celia wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Eduardo let go of Louisa's hand and turned to everyone. I want you to know that each of you taught me something. You taught me about resilience, about dignity, about the value of continuing even when everything pushes you to give up. And I want this place to continue being what it is, a place of hope. But now with more resources, more possibilities, more chances to transform lives. Gilberto stood up, embarrassed. "Mr. Cavalcanti, I treated you poorly, I didn't know." Eduardo interrupted him. "You treated me exactly how you treat those you think have no value, and that is something we all need to learn to change. Kindness cannot depend on who the person is or what they possess. It needs to be unconditional, as Luisa taught me." Gilberto nodded, ashamed. Eduardo spent the following hours talking to each resident, listening to stories, making notes about specific needs. He promised to help Jessica find her own housing and a daycare for her son. He promised to help Seu Augusto get proper health treatment. He promised dignified work for Tiago. They were not empty promises, they were real commitments. And in every promise, he saw Luisa beside him, suggesting, complimenting, making sure no one was forgotten. At the end of the afternoon, when everyone had already dispersed, Eduardo and Luisa were left alone in the courtyard. The same courtyard where they had talked so many times. "It's going to be strange not sleeping in a bunk anymore," Eduardo said with a smile. Luisa laughed. "I imagine your pillows are more comfortable." He became serious. "But they didn't make me sleep better. Here, even with all the discomfort, I slept with more peace than in years." Luisa looked at the sky that was beginning to darken. "What happens now, Eduardo?" "Now we build something that makes a difference," he replied. "Together. You with your kindness and I with the resources. A combination that can really transform lives." Luisa smiled. "I think I can get used to that." Eduardo looked at her, at that young woman who had so little and had given him so much. And for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly where he wanted to be and who he wanted to be. A better man. Transformed not by what he conquered, but by what he learned to value. Months later, the Luisa Ferreira Institute for Welcoming and Human Dignity was inaugurated in a renovated building in the East Zone of São Paulo. Luisa coordinated the activities with mastery, creating innovative welcoming programs that respected each person as a unique individual. Eduardo participated actively, not just financially, but being present, learning, changing the way he conducted even his main businesses. The story of the businessman who disguised himself to test human kindness spread through the media. Some criticized, saying it was manipulative. Others applauded. But for Eduardo and Luisa, what mattered was the real result. Hundreds of people being welcomed with dignity, families rebuilding their lives, dreams being rekindled, and at the center of it all, the most important lesson Eduardo had learned in that simple shelter in Brass. The greatest fortune is not in being admired, served, or recognized. It is in still being able to see the other with respect when there is no advantage in it. And it is precisely the simplest, humblest, and most silent people who, sometimes, carry within them the rarest strength of all. The capacity to return hope to those who no longer knew how to believe. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Eduardo and Luisa has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of transformation and discovery of true kindness, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you most in this story. Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and make us reflect on what really matters in life. Have you ever lived an experience that changed your way of seeing the world? Share it with us. We wait for you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions